The myth of the civilian Philips in the Wehrmacht, captured WWII, barracks receivers and communication was based on Torn.Fu and Feldfu. We teach you how to distinguish a leisure radio from a field station based on photos and signs. Exactly. An American patrol opens the door of a barracks on the outskirts of a German town. On the table, next to newspapers and a pack of Junos, there is a neat box with the Philips logo. Headphones are lying nearby. Spare lamps are stacked against the wall, and a piece of paper with a list of frequencies of Berlin and local broadcasting nodes is pinned to the receiver cover. For soldiers who were crawling under fire yesterday, this find looks like a clue to the whole German connection. The logic is simple and deceptively transparent. If there are Philips in the barracks, then they are the same in the fields, tanks, and headquarters. This is how the myth gets its first spark. To understand why this spark turned into a steady flame, you need to separate two worlds that may look the same from the outside. There is a world of radio broadcasting where the receiver is the eyes and ears of a soldier in non-combat life. News, music, leadership appeals. And there is a world of combat communications where the device is the nerve of the unit. Orders, coordinates, a call for fire, an ammunition consumption report. In the first case, you need a convenient, reliable, relatively easy-to-use receiver. The second one has a special radio station with a transmitter, precise frequency stabilization, operating modes, interfaces for a microphone or a telegraph key, power supplies in the field, and compatibility with standard antennas. These worlds intersect only in the imagination of an unprepared witness. In the German army, there was a whole direction called Truppenbetreuung, taking care of the life and mood of the troops. The radio here was the same instrument as the newspaper of the frontline editorial office or the concert brigade. For these tasks, the WR1 family of soldier receivers was created, including the WR1/P modification, released under the Philips Deutschland brand. The design of this barracks radio betrays its purpose at a glance. A scale marked for long and medium waves of broadcasting stations, large controls, a minimum of military connectors, and stowage in a convenient box. No microphone, no telegraph key, no standard nodes for the rapid deployment of a field antenna. It's a neat, army-style receiver, but still. Why did Philips come across so often at a military facility? The answer is prosaic. Philips factories operated in occupied Europe and in the Reich itself, producing radio tubes and assemblies for various electronics industries. The brand was visible, the logo was recognizable, and the demand for broadcast receivers for the barracks was great. Add to this the mix of suppliers. Some shipments came from Telefunken or Blaupunkt, others from Philips, and others were assembled at branches with common components. A soldier, journalist, or frontline photographer sees a familiar emblem and instantly summarizes it to the scale of the entire army. This is how a convenient formula is born. The Germans used civilian Philips. To be fair, the photos themselves are fueling the confusion. Often a captured room gets into the frame, where on one shelf there are household post-war devices from nearby houses, next to the soldiers WR1, and in the corner there is a field box that has nothing to do with radio communications at all. The signature, German radio station, lies on top of this visual vinaigrette and lives a separate life, wandering from article to article. Over time, personal memories are docked to it, where the radio in the dugout merges in memory with the walkie-talkie in position. The result is what psychologists call the false concreteness effect. A special case takes on the appearance of a universal rule. The myth also has a technological backstop. To the inexperienced viewer, the receiver and the radio station look the same, radio-like. Schematics, lamps, tuning knobs, wiring, everything suggests high engineering and therefore versatility. In fact, the differences are fundamental. A real field radio station has a transmitter unit, where output power, frequency stability, antenna alignment, and the possibility of telegraphic and telephone operation are important. It has standard connectors for headsets, keys, pedals, and sometimes built-in or external modulators, filters, stabilizers, and power supplies from various sources. The documentation prescribes the modes of listening on duty, the order of changing call signs and frequencies, and the time grid for synchronization. The broadcast receiver does not have such features, because it does not need it. The situation is aggravated by the museum effect. Exhibits are often incomplete. Paper labels could be missing from a soldier's receiver, cables, microphones, and keys from a field station. Then there are two similar boxes with lamps and handles in the showcase. Even an attentive visitor without a hint will easily get confused, and even more so a person who looked into an abandoned barracks in the spring of 1945 and hurried to his own. Do not forget about the role of the brand as a cultural marker. Philips is a name that has been associated with household appliances for decades. When a person sees him at a military facility, he instinctively reads the dissonance. How come there is a war and a civilian company? This dissonance is pleasantly resolved by a short and vivid story about the fact that the whole army was sitting in civilian clothes. History easily explains the complex world of military communications, eliminating the need to distinguish Torn.Fu, Feldfu, frequency plans, mode types, and channel organization. But the price of simplicity is the falsity of the conclusion. How can you break this cycle and not fall into the trap of a beautiful legend? The working rule is this. In each specific case, ask substantive questions about the hardware. Are there any traces of the transmitter and its controls? Where do the microphone and key connect? What ranges are marked on the scale, and for which services are they allocated? How does the power supply work? Is it possible to quickly switch to batteries or a manual generator? What is the marking on the nameplate, and are there any military acceptance marks? If the answer to at least 2 or 3 questions is no or not provided, you are almost certainly looking at a broadcast receiver adapted to an army situation, and not a means of combat communication. When you transfer these optics to trophy subjects, the Philips Everywhere legend is rapidly blown away to its real size. It turns out that soldiers' radios were a tool for information and leisure, and the visibility of the civilian brand is explained by industrial cooperation and the geography of production. It turns out that from the point of view of combat missions, completely different designs and factories were key. It turns out that the impressive logo on the front panel is just a logo, and not a universal answer about the enemy's communications architecture. Myths are tenacious because they simplify complex things. The radio history of the Wehrmacht is complex, heterogeneous, full of models, indexes, regulations, and exceptions. And it's all the more important to start analyzing it with an honest confession. What GIs found in the barracks could have been Philips, but it speaks to the cultural and industrial ecology of the war, not how orders were passed on the battlefield. Next, you will need to move from the barracks shelf to the signalman's backpack, from the broadcast scale to the frequency grids, from the impression to the document. This is exactly what we will do in the next chapter, where we will replace the legend with a list of real field radio equipment and the discipline that makes up the real connection. If a soldier listened to the news on WWII in the barracks, then a signalman deployed a completely different world at the position. A network of combat radio stations built to organize units. At the lower level, platoon and company commanders went into short lines of sight. Above that, the battalion and the regiment maintained stable communication to more distant lines. And above that, the division and the corps relied on powerful, stationary or automobile complexes. The names changed from plant to plant, but the architecture was repeated. Light portable VHF stations for short-range control, tornistor shortwave complexes for higher echelons and specialized units for artillery, tanks, and logistics services. The most recognizable infantry class is the portable Feldfu, B/D and similar modifications. These are low-power VHF radios for the platoon, company, battalion level. The design sets the tactics: compact body, telescopic or sectional pin antenna, headset with a tangent on a belt remote control, quick start without fine-tuning. The range is meter waves, where communication sees the horizon and suffers less from ionospheric vagaries and other people's long-range transmissions. The range in typical conditions ranges from 1 kilometer or 2 in a built-up area to several kilometers in the field. Antenna height, terrain, and broadcast discipline decide a lot. With this kit, the company controlled the fire of the squads, collected observer reports, and transmitted short orders. In terms of functionality, this is a full-fledged radio station. There is a transmitter. Separate handles are assigned to the controls. Standard connectors for a microphone, headphones, and external power sources are provided. The next stage is tornistor short, wave Torn.Fu, built as wearable or wearable complexes. They were taken to places where range and flexibility were required. Company, battalion, regiment communications, artillery observers, and interaction with neighbors. The ability to work not only with a telephone, voice, but also with a telegraph, key, is critical here, because telegraphy is more stable on bad routes and saves time and energy. The kit included packing boxes with receiver and transmitter units, a set of coils, circuits for different bands, cables for single or wire antennas, pins and pegs for quick mounting. The stations could be powered by dry batteries, accumulators through a vibration converter, an onboard car network, or a manual generator, depending on the task. Setting up in the field required skill. The signalman set the frequency on the scale, matched the antenna, controlled the anode and incandescent current, monitored the purity of the modulation and frequency departure. A separate line was the receivers of the Torn.Fu family. The letter E is Empfänger, receiver, of which Torn.B became almost a symbol of German radio clothing. This is not a leisure radio, although it looks similar. Laying, tubes, pens. But in terms of the meaning, it is a tool for monitoring the airwaves, listening to the networks of higher headquarters, checking channel occupancy, and working on reception in conjunction with a separate transmitter. In artillery and sapper units, such receivers could also be used as a backup information channel when their own broadcast was saturated with interference. Automobile and stationary complexes covered the upper floors of the department. Communication vehicles with masts and gasoline units provided divisional and corps units. Reception on duty, retransmission, access to the rear lines. Where the terrain allowed, wire antennas tens of meters long were pulled, tall masts were erected, and directional circuits were created for confident communication with a neighbor at a distance. Voice mode was convenient, but on long-distance routes, preference was often given to telegraphy, A1, or tone-modulated telegraphy, A2, since they break through better and are easier to read against noise. Tank units had their own sets. The towers had compact meter-high stations designed to control a platoon/company in motion, with a convenient headset and a tangent at the commander's hand. The tanks had an in-depth internal telephone network and PTT wiring, and the radio stations themselves communicated with the outside world via stable VHF networks. This is not the place for a broadcast receiver. Vibrations, interference from electrical equipment, requirements for quick channel readjustment, unification of ciphers and call signs. All this emphasizes the official nature of the kit. For this system to work, the boxes themselves are not enough. Procedures are needed. At all levels, there was a frequency plan with distribution across networks, command, artillery, logistics, and interaction. The units of airtime, the order of work, the change of call signs according to the schedule, the silence mode before the start of the operation. Mandatory control calls are an invisible but critical layer. At the bottom, for small stations, they emphasized voice economy, short, standardized phrases, tabular codes for standard messages so that the airwaves would not be clogged and commands would not be lost. At high levels, encryption tables and operating procedures for the radio, wire, courier bundle were added so as not to depend on a single channel. Antenna farming is a separate science. Near-range VHF sets loved height and openness. The higher the pin, the more stable the visibility. On KV, it is important to coordinate the length of the wire, the counterweight, and the quality of the grounding. Field practice has generated dozens of soldiers' tricks, from diagonal suspension between trees to the use of metal fences and awning masts as supports. The signalman always had a repair kit, spare lamps, fuses, insulators, pieces of wire, a nail for driving pegs, and the simplest monitoring devices. The range, purity, and resource of the equipment depended on this, no less than on the rated watts. The power supply is the source of most of the breakdowns, and half of the ingenuity. In the infantry, circuits with vibration converters from batteries were appreciated. Heavy, but predictable. In intelligence and observers, there were handheld generators at the site, noisy but autonomous. Gasoline units were spinning in the communication machines, which required fuel and maintenance, but allowed them to keep the node for days. There was one rule everywhere. The radio station should start when the situation requires it, and not when the outlet appears. It is important that this technique was fundamentally different, not only in terms of functions, but also in terms of operating culture. On the broadcast receiver, the soldier could turn the knob by ear, catching the music. At the field station, the signalman worked according to the frequency map, according to the regulations, and with the radio session log. He was responsible not for its sounds, it doesn't sound, but for passing the order and confirming it. Therefore, each model had a set of documentation, deployment instructions, rating tables, service routes, and fault checklists. The training teams were given practice, from setting up the antenna to reading the broadcast under interference and imitation of counteraction. The role of big brands like Philips in this landscape was different than it seems from the barracks photos. Yes, factories produced radio tubes, assemblies, and sometimes special kits for military orders. But the nerve of the system was held at the front by specialized lines of stations developed by Telefunken, Lorenz, Siemens, and other specialized design bureaus. This explains why in a real position you will not see a radio with a beautiful logo, but a harsh installation with antenna pins, cables, a key, a tangent, and a field instrument. The bottom line is simple. The real connection of the Wehrmacht is not a household radio in a barracks, but an entire ecosystem of military assets with clear roles and procedures. In the next chapter, we will put this principle into practice. We will take characteristic photos of trophies and show step-by-step how to distinguish a broadcast receiver from a real field radio station, without relying on the logo on the lid. Legends breed where the eye sees a box with handles, and the head draws a walkie-talkie. To stop being a donor of myths, it is not the impression that needs to be analyzed, but the signs. A photo is a piece of evidence. Each piece of evidence has fields where the answers are hidden. Panel, connectors, scale, housing, frame environment, and traces of exploitation. Let's go through them as a criminologist, not as a romantic. First, the control panel. A broadcast receiver is usually simple. A large general scale, 2 or 3 knobs, volume, tuning, sometimes tone, a built-in speaker, and a decorative grid. There are no transmit-receive switches, no output power control, no A1, A2 telephone keys, tone-free telegraphy, tone-modulated telegraphy, telephone voice. At a real field station, look for separate receiver and transmitter nodes, separate organs for setting up the heterodyne and matching, mode switches, and service labels in a technical language rather than an advertising one. The words senden, empfangen, TG, T-Tex, A1, A2/Telef, Abstimmung/Feinabstimmung, Antenna/Erde are good markers of official purpose. Next are the connectors. The broadcaster is satisfied with a power cord or battery input, and a pair of terminals for an external speaker. The field kit lives a dense switchboard life. Sockets for a headset, a microphone with a tangent, a telegraph key, external power sources, separate inputs for the antenna and ground, sometimes connectors for a vibration converter or a manual. Generator. Metal screw caps, micro, horror, T.taste format signatures, and standardized plugs give the professional away. The frequency scale is a knife at the throat of myth. Long and medium waves with cities/call signs of broadcasting stations under glass almost guarantee leisure radio. Meter ranges with divisions in megahertz, short. Wave sections with narrow scales, replaceable coils, blocks of ranges. Inscriptions about working grids are signs of a combat broadcast. A separate plus in karma is the presence of a window or a sign with a grid of frequencies and call signs. It's not for beauty, but for work. Body and styling. A soldier's broadcast receiver lives in the furniture aesthetics of a barracks. A neat box, sometimes wooden, sometimes plywood, sometimes army-colored, but without heavy reinforcements. Field stations like double boxes with latches, rubber shock absorbers, belts, pockets for coils, cables, insulators, antenna hardware. A procedure table, connection diagrams, and deployment instructions are often riveted on the lid or inner door. In the complex, antenna pins, coils of wire, pegs, insulators usually stick out from the station. All this gets into the frame and serves as hints, the environment of the frame. There are newspapers, a mug, a pack of cigarettes, and at best, spare lamps on the table of the broadcasting receiver. There are coils of cable, a key on a wooden block, a set of screwdrivers, terminal blocks, bobbins with wire, headsets in cases, and sometimes a portable gasoline generator or a manual drive. It is easy to understand from the surroundings this is a leisure corner or a control point. Traces of exploitation. The field engineer has noticeable scuffs on the tuning knobs, sawn fastener slots, dust in the area of the antenna input, pencil marks with frequencies and call signs. Barrack radio often has something polished that is touched every day. the volume knob, and the speaker cover. The erased pieces of paper with songs and a broadcast grid on the inside of the door also speak for themselves. Now there is a checklist that is convenient to keep nearby. 1. Determine the purpose. Whether there is a transmitter and its controls. If not, it is not a communication radio station. 2. Look at the scale. Megahertz, shortwaves, interchangeable bands, plus to the combat version, cities and LWMW, minus. 3. Look for interfaces. Microphone, dongle, headset sockets, antenna and grounding input. Their absence is an alarming signal. 4. Evaluate the power supply. External batteries, vibration converter, generator. Signs of service. Network only or a simple battery. For leisure. 5. Check the markings. Plates with Gerät number, EMF Zender, military acceptance stamps on the chassis and lamps. 6. Read the environment. What is nearby? What is used? What tools and consumables are in the frame? 7. Fix the context. A barracks, a position, a communications vehicle, a staff tent. All this changes expectations. Practice. Let's analyze 3 typical plots from which loud signatures are born. The first plot. The trophy room. There are 3 drawers on the shelf. The left one has a large scale, a tone knob, and a speaker grid. The middle one has a door, a table on the inside, and 10 ERDA terminals at the bottom. The right one has no dial, but it has a lot of sockets and switches, and a telegraph key is taped next to it. Correct analysis. The left is a household or soldier's barracks broadcast receiver. The middle is a soldier's WR, class for leisure, albeit in army coloring. The right is a component of a field station, or a full-fledged radio station. The signature, Philips German walkie-talkies, is incorrect, if only because only one of the 3 items is capable of transmitting at all. The second plot. A backpack on the ground, a pin sticking out of the lid. It is often signed as a walkie-talkie for separation. If you can see separate tuning knobs, a mode toggle switch, microphone and headphone sockets on the panel and straps, and a battery vibration converter compartment on the side, then this is really a portable short-range field station. The key is in the details. The antenna pin is sectional. There are additional sections and extensions nearby. A headset with a tangent. The scale marking is not Moscow, Berlin, but dry numbers and divisions. The third plot. A table. On the table there is a box with lamps and a separate unit with coils. The caption is German radio station. In fact, we may have a Torn.Fu type receiver paired with an external range unit, and possibly an autonomous power supply. There is no transmitter, which means that this is not a station, but a receiving path of the communication node, a listening and monitoring tool. They like to draw far-reaching conclusions with such a frame, but the honest signature sounds different. A field reception complex for working in networks. Additional traps. Having the logo of a well-known brand does not turn a broadcast box into a walkie-talkie. The absence of a military color does not negate a military purpose if the panel says, "I work on the air of combat networks," and vice versa. The army paint and nameplate do not mean the transmitter is inside. The original doesn't scream, it hints. Our job is to hear the hints. How to test yourself. First, formulate the hypothesis. What kind of node is this? A barracks broadcast receiver, a portable short-range communication station, a node receiver, an automobile complex. Then try to refute your own hypothesis with specific signs. If the refutation fails, proceed to identifying the model by the nameplates and characteristic elements, the type of handles, the shape of the terminals, and the layout. In controversial cases, record the confidence level and do not hesitate to write, probably. History loves precision more than self-assurance. Finally, the ethics of signatures. For a frame where there are no obvious signs of a transmitter, it is correct to write soldier's receiver, field receiving unit, or reception communication center, and not walkie-talkie. It is decent to add context to the subject with the frequency scale of broadcasting. It was used to inform personnel. If there are several devices in the frame, it is better to separate them by functions. On the left is a leisure receiver. On the right is a short-range field station. This economy of big words saves reputation and makes history cleaner. Photo parsing is a skill that pays dividends on more than one topic. He teaches you to look at an artifact as an engineer and as a historian, by signs, by procedures, by context. And after him, the legend Phillips is everywhere loses its magic. Because instead of magic, a method appears. And the method is transferred from frame to frame. From a trophy room to a field diagram. From a barracks to a communications vehicle. Then all that remains is to use it whenever a new drawer with handles is found.